welcome back to the Corporate Soul podcast series. I'm Tyler Norton. Thanks for joining us again for yet another episode of the Corporate Soul. As you might recall, we focus on principles of culture and ethos. I do share principles on the strategy side as well. Influence, really kind of pointing at the sales and sales processes under the broad moniker of influence, and leadership are the other dimensions, leadership and entrepreneurism. So we're excited that you'll join us here today. Today's topic that I want to talk about, I'll jump right in, has to do with the power of high activity, the principle and the power of high activity. And I'm speaking specifically to folks that are both building a business entrepreneurially that requires a great deal of self-motivation, a great deal of self-starter effort on their part. And some of you know that I was in sales and sales management a good portion of my career. Ultimately, I was a chief revenue officer for a 100-plus-year-old financial institution, a multi-billion-dollar entity, had thousands of salespeople that reported up through me across various channels. And during all those years of being in what I like to think of as street combat myself and working my way up into sales management, then I was a national director developing sales managers, general manager over 2 states, and then a vice president, senior vice president, and ultimately a chief distribution officer. That was all within a kind of a window of about 10 to 12 years that all of that occurred. And there were so many things I learned from so many great mentors that today what I want to focus on is the principle and power of high activity. The concept that how do you create an increased outcome working with a product maybe that people don't know about, may not even want. How do you promote and engender a sense of curiosity and interest along the way? And I'm going to share some principles. So today I would definitely categorize as the power and the principle of high activity in a sales environment, an environment where your influence will have an impact on your ability to drive your business, whether it's a small business or a direct sales business, a home-based business, or the like. Let me give you some context and background. You know, I didn't really set out to get into the sales world. I ended up there. I had a father-in-law who was a great influence in my life, who was in the insurance and investment industry, and who suggested that I probably could fit in that space. I absolutely hated my first several, if not months into even, a year plus into that industry. I just, I felt vulnerable every day. I used to write in a journal and say I felt like I woke up every day unemployed, which I think is a fair way to think about it. You really have to get up and make things happen on your own. Only 1 out of 10 people would survive in that industry. Over 4 years, that was the industry statistic. I think it was like something of close to 1.4 out of 10 people. And so maybe I was a glutton for punishment. I don't know why, but my father-in-law had encouraged me, and I got into the business. And there were some things that it got much, much easier when I learned the principles I want to talk about with all of you today. Let me start by sharing a phrase that I think is a really powerful way to think about the selling process. So, and the phrase is this: conviction sells, emotions buy. Let me start there. So conviction sells and emotions buy. And logic over time pays the subscription, pays the ongoing a dollar amount, or pays for the ongoing engagement as your customer. And early on in my career, I thought that logic sold. I thought once people saw that this made sense, that the math added up, it kind of goes back to my background in economics. I studied economics at the university, and in microeconomic theory, and I'm going to be talking about some otherwise slippery concepts in economics. I'll try not to put you to sleep with those. But if you remember from your microeconomic classes, if you took any, there are some assumptions that economists make about people in general. One of them is that people are rational, so that when they go to make a decision about their resources, about what they want to do, they are logical. And boy, early on in my career, I realized people aren't logical, people aren't rational, they're emotional. And while I could appeal to the rational and the logical with some types of personalities, in many cases, that wasn't enough. In other words, when 2 + 2 = 4, I put it in front of someone, and it should have created a moment of inertia where they actually should have been willing to do something, and they didn't. And so I met a gentleman, a real great mentor, who said to me, never forget that conviction sells, emotions buy, and that the logic process, that comes into play downstream when people are rethinking why they're doing what they're doing and what it is that they've got ongoing. But early on in the process, don't over-rely on logic. And so that was an interesting concept for me to capture. Then I began to unpack and start to explore, well, what generates conviction, right? How do you inspire and increase your conviction? If you're in any kind of an entrepreneurial position that requires you to generate revenue, so again, small business owners, I know lots of small business owners that never wanted to be in sales, but by virtue of them being in small business, they don't have a choice. They are in sales. And so there's a lot of people, even like I've met attorneys that said, I never wanted to be in sales, and they open their own firm, and then they've got to go out and generate revenue. I find that these principles apply across so many ranges because of that. Virtually any meaningful going concern is going to require revenue generation and demand generation. And if you can understand these principles, I think it'll be less painful. So early on, I was learning this concept of conviction sells, emotions buy. Logic, third in the process, logic takes over downstream when someone is rationalizing a purchase they've made. Now remember, I was working in financial services, and so sometimes that was an ongoing premium or an ongoing investment into a retirement account. That was more of a logic play downstream. But the early on engagement, that moment of inertia when someone has a choice point and says, I'm going to buy something, I'm actually going to start a new program, was really more dependent on their emotional response to my belief and conviction of this being a good thing. Now, lest you feel or think, I'm going to make sure I've got a little tablet here that I don't want to go to sleep. Lest you think that that's soft or something, let me walk you through this concept of conviction sells and emotions buy. And remember, my thesis today is the power and the principle of high activity in generating revenue, demand, sales, and influence in your business, which is a dimension that I like to speak about in these Corporate Soul podcasts. So let me talk a little bit about how this works. If in microeconomic theory they make three assumptions, the assumption one is, of course, that people are rational or logical, so that when positioned in front of an opportunity or a choice point, they're going to rely on rational response. I learned, again, from my experience, good and bad, that not all people made decisions just based on that. They did want to maximize their utility, and that's, again, a microeconomic term. Utility meaning satisfaction, happiness, enjoyment, success, anything positive that was worthwhile to them could be dimensionalized as utility. And so in microeconomic terms, people that you work with or interact with are looking to maximize utility. They're logical or rational. And the third dimension that is also a misnomer, economists are worthy of our derision when we think about all these assumptions they make, is that they have access to perfect information. Well, I can tell you right now, most people don't have access to full information. Despite the internet, despite their ability to search something on Google, people don't have perfect information. So first takeaway, microeconomic theory is flawed in that it assumes people are logical, they have access to the necessary information to make a decision, and ultimately that they want to maximize their happiness. What I did learn is that people are emotional, coupled with logic and rational response. They don't have all the information all the time, whereupon they can rely and to make a decision, particularly a buying decision of some sort. And I do believe people set out to maximize what they define as their utility, something that matters to them, that brings them happiness, that brings them satisfaction or joy, etc. And so when you stop and think about this concept of how do people make decisions, is it logic? Do they just rely on rational thought? Is it because they have all the cards in front of them, all of the perfect information, they know how to make a decision? Or do they respond more to some sort of emotional response? And it wasn't until I understood that, look, I need to be coming at things from a point of conviction. Now, that conviction should not be baseless or without foundation. It needs to be inspired by and informed by good, meaningful information. So there is an element of rational, logical approach. But it sometimes was more my sense of being able to communicate conviction to them. And so That was very, very helpful to me early on. Conviction sells, emotions buy, logic pays the ongoing dollar amounts to stay involved in a subscription or a product or a program. So early on, I found myself really working on, well, what promotes my conviction? And I think we could unpack that, right? I think we could double click into that and start expanding. Where does conviction come from? Is it product knowledge? Is it product use, right? The concept of, if I go to the car dealership and you're selling me a Ford, but you drive a Honda, it's tough for me to believe and understand that. But if you're driving a Honda, selling me a Honda, and speak from a place of, this is what I do, that seems to add conviction and meaningful kind of source credibility to the discussion. So early on in my career, I learned that I really needed to design and engineer conviction. If you're an entrepreneur leading other people, I would challenge you to think of this as, you are the chief conviction officer. Your job is to break down the barriers to one's belief and own motivation, and attack anything inside of your value proposition that does not promote and engender a sense of conviction that what you have to offer, whether a product or a service or an experience, whatever dimension of the economy you play in, that there's value there, and you can speak to that value from a place of deep and abiding conviction. So if what convinces is conviction, if conviction sells and emotions buy, the first dimension of success was this idea of, do you believe? And if you don't believe, there's an interesting question that was posed to me early on, is, what do you need in order to believe? In other words, what's missing, right? And also this concept of, what do you need to believe? In other words, do you know what it is you're trying to believe in? Again, seems a little slippery, but it's a really important concept that as I've consulted literally hundreds of small businesses and corporations over time, worked with lots of people in direct sales, and of course in the high self-motivation, self-starter financial and insurance industry, this question of, do you believe? And if not, what do you need in order to believe, or what do you need to believe in? Meaning, do you not have a deep conviction of a product or a concept? And it wasn't until I had some tap roots, if you will, of belief that were digging down into the soil of someone's career that I could really help them to move into what is the power and principle of high activity. So I do want to start by saying the baseline of your effort early on is to check in on belief. If you lead a team of people in the sales environment, and I've spent decades in that space, check in with belief, product belief, overall brand experience belief. Do people have a deep abiding conviction that what they're going out into a marketplace and suggesting is worth something, that someone should trade value, dollars for product, dollars for service or experience? That belief has to be there. So how does it work from there? Well, I'm going to say some things that aren't rocket science, and you could quickly dismiss them or just kind of end the podcast right now, but I want to challenge you to kind of stay with me through this. If there's any truth to the notion that simplicity lives on the far side of complexity, then there's something that I'm going to tell you that may sound very simple or plain, but it's gone through the far side and through the complexity to get there, at least in my case, and I think it's worth your time to consider. And here's the notion. High activity is an extremely important component in overall success if you're trying to build a business that requires high self-motivation, high self-starter. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that if you are speaking with that deep abiding conviction and you're doing it in a way that's highly active, it enables you to approach each person with the right mindset. And that mindset is one that I've said for years, it's kind of a play on words, and it's going to sound a little off, so bear with me for a second here. The mindset is, indifference makes the difference. I'll say it again. Indifference makes the difference. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that you're so indifferent to the person that you treat them like an object. If you go back to one of our earlier podcasts on influence, I speak to the power of seeing all people as people, treating them as people. And that's very, very important for me. But why would I tell you that indifference, meaning a form of not caring, makes the difference? And the reason I say that is because sometimes our activity is so low that we want something more than an end customer or buyer wants it. And that imbalance of us caring too much, right, for the outcome, which is many times camouflaged as just our own self-interest. We're really not operating from a place of conviction that says, I have something of extreme value that I have absolutely no doubt or question will be of value to you. That's conviction. That's an important part of this. But if I want it for that person more than they want it, you've now put yourself in a absolutely compromised position. You are in a weaker position. The way you pivot that is you increase your activity. Now, in order to kind of walk you through this, I want to share kind of an economic law. By the way, this is the first time I will be drawing something, so hopefully this works on the podcast for you guys. But I'm going to toggle over to this particular thing. I'll turn my little picture-in-picture on so you can see me in the top right corner. And I just want to draw you a graphic here that maybe you can use in the way you think about this. In the economics, there is if I just do a graph here, and I measure this notion of utility, satisfaction on the left side. So let's call this utility, satisfaction, happiness, value to me. And I measure the number of units of something down here, so the number of things I buy. There is a law called the law of diminishing marginal utility. Don't let it scare you. It's actually a pretty simple concept. But what it says is that as if this is 1 over here and this is some X number up in here, this is N. I'll put 100 over here. That I have an increase, and this is of course low here to high here. So I'll put 1 to 100 here, just for the sake of this exercise on the y-axis. You've got this concept that says, as I start to interact with something that I deem of some value, it has increasing value to me. So I'm drawing this curve that's climbing. But there comes a point where I hit this point where more of that, meaning more units on this x-axis down at the bottom, does not necessarily mean greater satisfaction. In fact, it gets to a point where it has what they call diminishing returns. It starts to come down. So let's kind of dissect this for a minute and see if this makes any sense. So I'm sorry if I offend anybody that is a vegetarian, but I do like to have a nice steak every once in a while. So I'm going to use something that's relevant to me in this discussion. And I'm going to say, what happens if I have not had a really nice steak for a very long time? And I'm about ready to go out and I'm going to slice my graphic right here, number 1. I'm going to have a steak, and the utility of that is good. And maybe I have another steak, and this is 2, and it's still climbing. I just love the fact that I'm able to have a dinner that I enjoy. But if I keep having it, I have it for lunch, maybe I have it for dinner again, but there comes a point where, like, gosh, I've had this several times. This is now my 5th or 6th in a row steak that I've had. There comes a point where it's kind of like, I don't want to have this anymore. You hit this apex at the top here, and you don't really want to have it anymore. And you say, I'm kind of done with the steak thing. How about if I just have, like a bowl of cereal or something? This is called the law of diminishing, meaning going down, marginal, meaning by unit, utility. It means it starts to go down. So if you looked here, let me change my color for you guys. And if you said, okay, well, here is, let's use red. Notice that where I'm putting this red circle up in here, let me make that a little bit brighter. And you said, okay, this circle up here that's kind of red-brown up there, that was kind of high. But if I have one more steak, if I have one more XYZ, call it a Caesar salad, whatever it is, gosh, I've had so many of them that they're starting to diminish in their value to me. Now, why does this matter? Why would I bring this up in this discussion of high activity? Well, assume for a minute that it's not steak or Caesar salad or anything else that we're talking about. What if I'm talking about the number of people with whom I am speaking? What if we're talking about the more activity I have? So measuring down here on the bottom of our screen, I'll use kind of a blue color down here. As this climbs up down at the bottom, as this arrow left to right at the bottom goes up, instead of measuring units of a salad or a steak or anything else you want to use, you start to measure the number of people I'm speaking with. Well, if there's some truth to this law that says that the more you do this, right, the more this happens, then it's going to mean less to you over time. And what that allows for is a very natural order to emerge. And that natural order is this concept of indifference now begins to become your model. If I had a steak and it was my 8th one in a row, I've had it for breakfast, I had steak and eggs, I had a steak sandwich for lunch, I had a nice big steak and a potato for dinner, and I keep having the next morning, I have steak and eggs again. The next day at lunch, I have a steak. A client wants to go to lunch and gets a steak. And by the time I look back, I'm like, why am I getting so tired of having the same thing? That's what this law says. This law says that as you continue to interact with the same thing, the utility or satisfaction measured on the y-axis begins to decrease as the units go up. Now, let me turn this off for just a second and come back to you. What does that really mean if you stop and think about it? What it suggests is that if you have high activity, you have the ability to be somewhat indifferent. And let me restate indifferent to emotionally, you can dislocate. You have a refined indifference. You no longer are worried about what happens to this one steak, that I haven't had steak for 6 months and I'm not going to have steak again for 6 months. What is the value I see on that single steak? It becomes pretty high, right? In the case of my graph, it probably starts, that first unit starts higher. But if you said, okay, if I have steak every single day, morning, lunch, dinner, every day, what happens is the relative value of that starts to go down. So what happens if I'm talking to people every day? I stop placing so much importance or response on any one single steak, or as it were, one single conversation, one single person. I start to realize I'm talking to a lot. Now, I jokingly say, so what happens if the steak I have is the 12th steak and it slips off my plate as I'm cutting into it, and my dog is right there beneath me at the feet and thinks I've given it to him or her, and they run off with the steak and have a great dinner? What's funny is if that's my 15th in a row, I'm less concerned about the loss of that steak. I'm like, oh, well, I've been having steak every day. If that was the only steak I was going to have for the next 12 months, I would be absolutely distraught about the fact that that happened. Now, make the transition with me. And again, I'm probably insulting your intelligence, but thanks for staying with me. I don't mean to. What I'm saying is, until I understood this, until I understood that my job was not to just angle at or aim at one steak at a time. My job was to have a lot. I was to be speaking to a lot of people. And the more people I spoke to, that diminishing return, right? This graphic where it starts to come down, they meant less to me. Now, not as human beings, not as people, right? This wasn't a game of me saying they don't mean anything to me. It had way more to do with the fact that I knew I was going to be speaking to so many more other people that it didn't matter to me how they responded. Now, something really powerful happens when you begin to lean into this, when you begin to actually really genuinely say, I'm going to be indifferent about this. I tell people come up to me and say, I can't get my sister to do this product with me or to buy this. I can't even get my own family to do this. And sometimes I'll say to them, leave them alone. Be indifferent about it. The reason you're over obsessing on a single client, a single customer, a single person in your team that you want to convince to come join you is because you're overly focused on that one unit, that one steak, and you're not having enough. And so they sense that you want it more than they do. And I'm going to liberate you right now. If you're in an environment where you're trying to sell, your job is to have deep, abiding conviction that what you're doing is of value, is meaningful, is desirable. Someone should want this. And at the exact same time, what you should be doing is marrying your message with a certain refined indifference. That refined indifference, that certain amount of, I don't care what you do, will be very intriguing and curious to the people with whom you're speaking. Why? Well, because everyone they're talking to, every message, they're getting bombarded on Facebook, every social media platform, they drive down the freeway, they see, every message is trying to get their attention. But remember, what's the early premise of this whole podcast is conviction sells, emotions buy. If I speak with conviction about something I'm deeply convicted about, something I believe in, am I on trial by speaking my belief? The answer is no. If I'm trying to sell something that I have a marginal or modest belief in, you can sense that feeling of someone looking at you with a sense of you're on trial. Now, this may feel a little slippery, but if you can get this concept that the law of diminishing, that means going down, of course, decreasing satisfaction or utility from a single unit. The more, and that's why it's called marginal, by the way. The law of diminishing marginal means each additional one on the margin, each new one means less to me if I've had steak every day. Well, what if I'm talking to dozens of people a day? What if I rev up the RPMs of my activity engine so that all I'm going to do is talk to people every day? What happens is for you to lose any one person's interest, response, or favor, to be honest, is really meaningless to you because you know you have so much activity. Now, that's your side of the equation. What's happening to the person that happens to be listening to you? That person is noticing a certain amount of refined indifference coupled with a deep, abiding conviction. When you couple conviction with refined indifference, right, you're unstoppable. That is if you have high activity. If you have a deep, abiding conviction, you would think, if you believe so deeply in something that it's inspiring your activity, you would suggest, if I believe, I'm going to act. Belief always precedes action, right? You wouldn't get up to go to work if you didn't believe that you were going to make it to work. So all meaningful action is preceded by belief. If you have a deep, abiding conviction in your product, service, or experience that you have to offer to somebody else, and you marry that with high activity because you say, hey, this is valuable and I'm going to speak about it to as many people as I can, or I'm going to get out and be as active as I can in my target markets, what then is happening is you're now have the ability to step back and have a certain amount of refined indifference to their response. When that refined indifference starts to actually play out, the counterpoint to that is people begin to be more curious to that. Because they sense that you're not wanting something more than they want it, they actually start to genuinely look at it without a jaundiced eye, without this sense that someone is trying to manipulate or take advantage of me. I was talking to a really dear friend of mine who has years of experience in a similar direct sales selling industry as some of my background, and we were talking about this simple concept of activity is the watchword. The watchword of anybody in a self-starter, self-motivated, or inside of a corporate sales environment is activity. Increased activity coupled with deep, abiding conviction that promotes an emotional response in people enables indifference, and indifference makes the difference. Another way to think about this that I've said for years, care less, but don't be careless. Think about that for a minute. Care less, but don't be careless. How does that find expression in your process? Okay, remembering. Let's review a little bit. I'm suggesting to you that high activity enables a certain amount of indifference. High activity says, I know I'm going to be speaking to so many people that if the timing and circumstance and situation isn't right for you to respond to my conviction right now, I'm indifferent. I'm simply sharing from a point or place of deep, abiding conviction, something I know is valuable to you. And I'm going to honor your agency. I'm going to honor your ability to choose. When we start to try to change someone's eye color, that is to convince them unnaturally, we get overly anxious, overly concerned and interested in their response to my conviction, our position of strength is absolutely diminished. We are now in a place where we're in the weak position of a relationship. We're not speaking from a place of conviction about something that they could or should want. We're speaking about it more from the perspective of what we want. And I have learned from very sad and painful experience over the years, you don't win in that model. You just don't. Contrast that with you having such an abiding belief and conviction in what it is that you're about, what it is that you're promoting, what it is that you're sharing, that you're more concerned about the fact that you're sharing it with as many people as you can, such that the timing and circumstance and interest level on their side will increase. And you're really indifferent to how they respond to it because, again, your conviction suggests it's not on trial. I'm not asking your opinion about this. I already know what it is that I'm doing and how important it is. And really, if you think about that, in that moment where you can signal that deep abiding conviction and marry it with a refined indifference, right? Their curiosity and genuine baseline level of interest and intrigue goes to its natural place. It goes to the natural order. And when they think that you're overly trying to convince them of something, then there's some very natural learned reflexes that start to come into play that put you in a weaker position. Let me share a story. So as I told you, I spent years in the financial services industry. I had a very dear friend that I had given a referral to that was on my team. So I was a sales manager at the time. I had one of the top performing teams in a 160-year-old national company. We were top 3 in the country this particular year out of about 140 teams. One of my top producers would always badger me for referrals. He would come into me and say, hey, I'm trying to hit a goal and objective. Who do you know that I should be talking to? And I just loved his energy. And so I gave him a referral of someone I had met actually in an intramural sports league. This was years and years ago when I was playing intramural sports. And this guy was a president of a home builder, of a home building company. His dad had started. He was the son, and they were starting to transition to him. So the guy on my team goes out, meets with this gentleman. They have a good discussion. He takes an application, in this case on an insurance policy, that the person desperately needed. There was no question that there was a need there. But there was no response. They stopped. The communication stopped. And my producer on my team came into me and said, you gave me this referral. This guy's not responding to me. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he just said, I can't get him to call me back. And he showed me this contact list that he had printed off of all the attempts to reach out to him. And it was funny because I could sense that he wanted it more than perhaps the client, who desperately needed this, by the way, was reacting and responding to. He was in that weaker position. We called the person, and he said, you call him. So I called him, and I said, listen, we don't care what the answer is. Give us an answer. I want this off our to-do list. We have this product approved. Do you want to do this or not? There was a certain amount of almost like, I want this off my to-do list. And the person was on the phone with me and said, you're right, I'm not giving this the time and attention. I had to put an edge of, I don't care what your response is, but give me a response. When you're collecting a decision, that indifference matters because the person thinks naturally, you're trying to sell me something, so I'm not going to respond to you. I'm in the driver's seat here. Well, I say, hey, declare your independence from that person and quickly decide that this is either going to go or not go, and let it go if it's not going to go. Why don't people do that? Why aren't people willing to do that? Is because they've not had enough high activity to be willing to call for a choice point with the people they're talking to. And so they end up overly trying to accommodate the timing for that person or any number of other things. I actually come at it from a different angle. The more you care about those dynamics, the weaker your position gets. Collect a decision, do it respectfully, but move quickly and do it with a certain air of indifference to their response, because I'd much rather know the facts of my situation and act accordingly. That is, if this is not a viable piece of business, if this is not a viable customer, I don't want to keep kidding myself with them in the funnel of my activity, suggesting that they might someday change their mind. I think the best thing I could do is simply liberate them and myself from any false or misconceived, thought process that says, what, they might want to do something with me. What that tends to do is fill your day with kind of false notions about what's possible, and you end up wasting your time. When you have high activity, coupled with a high degree of conviction that what you're doing has value, and that's key, that adds value, whether it's in service, product, experience, whatever it is, if you are not on trial in your own heart and mind, and that deep abiding conviction is the place from which you campaign, then when you go out and begin to be highly active, you can increase your indifference to people's response. That increased indifference will awaken a form of natural curiosity inside what I like to call the natural order. They will begin to pay attention and interest to you. Now, you can't feign this. You can't fake this. You can't fake the indifference when you've only got 2 or 3 people to talk to. And that's why it's so important to be curating the top of your funnel, whether it's lists, whether it's lead gen, whether it's developing and nurturing a database that you're going to over time drip to and develop. But until you have high activity, you won't be able to demonstrate this form of refined indifference that says, I have steak every day. Don't care if this one falls off the table and my dog happens to get that steak. I'm comfortable losing it, comfortable losing you as a possible option because I have a lot of people to talk to, and I'm not on trial. What I'm doing is adding value. Again, doesn't matter what your product or experience is, as long as you have a deep abiding belief that what you're doing is additive and that it's going to make a difference. So as I used to teach this over the years, I found myself saying, if someone could just learn that conviction sells, emotions buy, logic keeps paying for it over time, right? As long as there's some value being transferred, logic will take over downstream. But when you try to flip that and you start to sell from a place of logic, you won't have as much success. Even though you might be an accountant type, you might be a very analytical type, and even the buyer might be analytical. I've still found if you overplay rational, logical as being your only key on the piano that you're playing to get someone to do something and buy something, you're going to make a mistake. If you can come at this from the perspective that my conviction is not on trial, I'm sharing it with you, but I'm sharing it with lots of other people. There's your high activity framework. And I'm sharing it to give you an opportunity to look at it. But if you don't, timing, circumstance, situation isn't right for you, no problem. I'm moving quickly. Whereas the opposite tends to occur, particularly in self-starter deals where there's high commission environment, you're not paid just to be active, you only are paid if someone buys something. There's this real temptation to cheat the system, and you begin to place too much attention or priority on a single person. By the way, in the insurance industry, this can take the form of, I'm going to go meet with a doctor who maybe has a bunch of needs that suggest high opportunity for me to generate a commission. A lot of this stuff happens. I would suggest you treat everyone you meet, regardless of their socioeconomic strata, regardless of you thinking they might have great influence on additional sales, doesn't matter. Treat them all exactly the same. Normalize your interaction with the people in terms of their potential for you, and you will increase their natural interest back in what it is you're promoting. If you're starting to create a differentiated level of interactivity with these people based on what you think they can do for you, it smells like really bad cologne, and people can smell it a mile away. It's tough to get away from. So as I've learned this over the years, I've really said my job, if I'm leading a sales organization, is to really say, how deep is the abiding conviction of my team? Do people feel that in a competitive sense, we're a very unique and competitive product? Have I given competitive advantage or differentiation to my sales organization such that when they go out and communicate in the marketplace, they're communicating from a place of deep, abiding conviction on a set of differentiated values and advantages? If that's the case, then what's next is I need to promote high activity. Now, a couple last things. I'm looking at my time and don't want to go too much longer, but what does this concept of high activity come from? Well, I highly recommend that you don't keep the score on just the end result. You need to back into keeping the score on the activity. Number of people that you might speak to, number of names you might be referred to, or names you might curate onto a list. These are high value activities, even though they may not result in an incidence of revenue to you or your business, or a commission if you're a salesperson. So your job becomes to kind of back away from the lagging indicators of success, i.e. an onboarded new client, move forward up in the funnel into, or up the funnel into a set of activities that lead to those outcomes, and then place value on that activity. So an example of this, early in my career, I simply kept track of one metric every week, and that was I needed to set 10 face-to-face meaningful discovery opening appointments with new potential prospects. Actually, we called these folks suspects, people we suspected could become a prospect. And we would go out, and my goal every week was to set 10 what we called openers. This was face-to-face discussions with someone we believed had the means and potential interest in doing business with us. And that one simple activity metric, tracking every week how many face-to-face opening appointments I had scheduled, not even had held, by the way. Notice the difference. I wasn't keeping track of the number of appointments that I held that week. I was simply saying it was my job to make sure that regardless of how many appointments I held that week, I also needed the activity of setting new appointments. Now, I don't know what shape that takes in the industry or business where you might find yourself, but think about the simple metric of high activity, of setting appointments. Now, what's happening to my psyche is I'm becoming more and more convinced I don't need any one person to buy or not buy. If I know that I have parallel pathing, several conversations and interactions, and more to come. And by keeping that top of funnel activity happening, right, what is that enabling? Assuming I have conviction, and remember, conviction sells, emotions buy, it's now enabling apathy of some level, refined, dislocated emotional response. I can disconnect myself from the response of any one person because I have steak every day. If I lose one steak, I'm eating it all the time. That's the law of diminishing marginal utility applied to the power and principle of high activity, which suggests that if you will start to treat everyone as though it's a steak you have every day, it becomes more natural. And people feel less as though you're trying to convince them or cajole them or overly concerned about something. You know the weak position when you're trying to get someone else interested in something you have. So the way you combat that is not through better language at the moment, it's increased activity. And the more you get your activity up, the less time and energy and interest you'll have in trying to change someone's eye color, which is the term I use, the metaphor I use. Don't run around trying to change someone so aggressively to serve really what becomes a very self-interested notion. Turn it, and if you have deep abiding conviction, remember that is the precondition. If you don't have a deep abiding conviction about what it is that you're doing, what it is you're representing or offering, frankly, all of the subsequent discussion about high activity becomes less valuable. But if you can couple a deep, abiding conviction, remember, conviction sells, emotions buy, that deep, abiding conviction needs one more thing, and that is high activity in the markets that you target as being most relevant. With that high activity and that sense that my convictions are mine, I'm not on trial, now what's happening? My convictions aren't on trial. I know what I know. I believe what I believe. I'm simply campaigning from a place of conviction. I'm not necessarily weakening myself in trying to sell you something you may or may not need. Now, what happens if someone says, well, they do need it, but they won't respond to me? Then leave them alone. Declare independence from anyone. Don't let that situation become a place where you burn energy, where there's wasted energy that you're releasing on someone where the timing, circumstance, or interest levels are not there. What's interesting is as you move away from this notion of I'm going to try to change their eye color and continue to hit this key on the piano, when you move off of that and you start to work on high activity in other environments, the success coupled with the natural indifference, this refined emotional dislocation from how they might respond, actually awakens a sense of intrigue and curiosity to that person who otherwise might be dismissive. Are you understanding the kind of the nuance of what I'm talking about? So today's message is conviction sells, emotions buy, logic pays ongoing. If you've got deep abiding conviction and if you're leading salespeople, your job as the chief conviction officer, you have to be teaching them why what they have, why what they're offering is so unique and valuable. Now pivot to high activity. And if that's something as simple as I'm building a home-based business and I want to develop a list of people to work with, then your job is to have a lot of people flowing through that list. And then what do you know? There's no anxiety in approaching someone if you're indifferent to their response. The anxiety is how they might think of you. The anxiety is how they might respond to you. But what if you have so many steaks lined up to eat that you're like, I don't really care if I don't have a steak. In fact, it would be kind of nice not to. That enables you to treat and see people as people, treat them with the respect, honoring their agency, which is a very powerful concept we could go deep on in a totally different podcast. Honoring the ability for that person to choose. And by them sensing that from you, their appreciation for you as authentic and real goes up. Their natural curiosity in what your convictions are becomes just that. It becomes natural. It's authentic. And in that environment, the only thing you have to keep doing is keep the activity up. And I've seen this. I've seen when people have high activity and things are going very, very well, people are responding very favorably to them. They let that activity decline. They start to zoom in and focus on a big potential prospect instead of just being even and treating all the same. And they start to lose the, if you will, the power. I'm not speaking of manipulative power. I'm not talking in any way about that. I don't like the sales language that treats it like you're hunting, like you bagged a deer. I hate that stuff. I don't think about closing a sale. I think about opening a mind. That's the way I want to think about how we sell. But if you're selling something, if you're sharing something you believe is worthy of action, that can generate an incidence of revenue for you and an incidence of value and impact to someone else, you're not on trial. You should do that from the perspective that says, I don't care what these people say or think. If it's a fit for them, great. If it's not, I'm going to move. I'm going to be highly active. As long as I set my 10 openers every week, what did I know for sure? I knew for sure that I was going to have activity the next week or the week after, and that enabled me to treat in the natural order each individual discussion as though it was a steak I was having after having had 50, and I'm going to have 50 more. And so I've normalized how I treat, see, and interact with that individual unit, right? That one person. And what's beautiful about that is it's no longer convincing. It's no longer high anxiety for you. You're speaking from a place of conviction. Now, what happens if I only have one of those a week? By definition, you can't really show genuine and natural refined indifference that makes the difference. You tend to be overly concerned with their response because of what it means to you, not what it could mean in terms of value added to them. So these are pretty basic concepts, but all too often our natural reflexes pull us back into these positions of weakness where we're not showing the strength of a certain refined indifference. And that's why I say indifference makes the difference, right? So you say, okay, well, how do I get that level of indifference? If it matters a great deal to me, how do I act as if it doesn't? You have to increase activity. And if you can increase activity coupled with a deep abiding conviction of what you're doing, you'll have conviction, high activity, and then a certain amount of refined indifference. And watch what'll happen. Mark my words. People will begin to show natural interest in something because they sense the natural order of you honoring their agency. If you can't get a client or a person to respond favorably to what you have, then move. Then leave them alone. Move on. Regenerate activity in different locations. It will awaken a sense of the natural order. So guys, I hope this is helpful. These are slippery in some ways, kind of hard to get your hands around, but I have lived this and I have seen remarkable success in teams that I've built over time that just get this clarity that my job is not to be an expert in any one field. I don't have to over communicate anything. I just have to be highly active and campaign from a place of conviction, and then couple that with a certain amount of indifference to their response, knowing that I'm going to stay active, and where the time and circumstance is right, I will honor people's agency, and certain people will see the value I represent. So remember, conviction sells, emotions buy, logic pays the subscription. Logic pays ongoing every month, or whatever it is the program you're offering. High activity unlocks the ability for you to be refined in your indifference to someone else's response. That refined indifference is a signal to someone that you're honoring their agency. These are adults you're talking with. They can choose for themselves. And when they sense that you're honoring that, not taking the traditional posture of trying to change their eye color, but simply campaigning from that place of conviction, it's my belief, and I've seen it time and time again, you will start to see increased positive results, and you'll start building something of substance and value that will endure and prevail. If you stay in that negative kind of de minimis position of I'm trying to get someone to like or want what it is that I have on low activity, you're going to be frustrated more than you're going to be happy. You're not going to see the kind of enduring and prevailing success you hope for. So high activity, deep abiding conviction, and then a certain amount of refined indifference will make the difference. Great to be with you guys. Hope this was helpful. By the way, how does this link back to corporate soul? If you can't see that this is honoring people, this is seeing people as people, this is coming from a place of conviction. There's so much rich cultural kind of underpinning to what I'm talking about that if you get this right and now marry high activity with it, you'll be building a corporate soul while still developing and reaching financial imperatives and results, which I'm not suggesting by any stretch are not central to any good business. But I think making the economics the only thing and giving away some of these principles of influence and how to interact with people tends to kind of kill the corporate soul. So hopefully you can connect those dots, and hopefully this is helpful. Great to be with you guys today. Happy holidays to all of you. Certainly, I think we're all looking forward to learning from 2020 and moving into a fresh new year with 2021. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to sharing more with you as we go forward with the corporate soul. Thanks, guys.